Sonic the Hedgehog, Crazy Taxi, Echo the Dolphin, Streets of Rage, Jet Set Radio. These are just a few of the foundational franchises that defined an era of video games established by the SEGA Corporation. But few companies have had as big of a rise and as catastrophic of a fall as SEGA. And while SEGA has been around for nearly 70 years, its heyday and chance to be the biggest company in gaming lasted for only a decade. But there was a time long ago in a mythical age known as the 90s, when SEGA and their greatest rival were locked in battle over video game industry dominance, only for a few major mistakes and the industry changing to turn them into a relic of the past. But what made SEGA special, even when compared to 30 years of technological advancement afterward? Could they have won the so-called console wars if things had gone a little differently? And what brought down a gaming giant when victory seemed so close? This is the meteoric rise and catastrophic fall of SEGA.
SEGA.
Few video game companies are as synonymous with the 1990s as that of the organization once known as Service Games. But in order to better understand the highest of highs and the lowest of lows that were experienced by the SEGA Corporation, we need to bring you all the way back to their founding, all the way back in 1940, and in what might surprise you, the United States. See, what would eventually become one of Japan's major video game companies was originally an American pinball business called Standard Games, which was founded in May of 1940 by Martin Bromley, Irving Bromberg, and James Humpert, beginning in Hawaii. Specifically, Standard Games made coin-op games like slot machines and pinball that targeted US soldiers stationed on Hawaiian military bases, with the company soon changing its name to Service Games because of its connection to those in the military service. Yes, very patriotic. And for a few years, business was good until New York Mayor Fiorello Henry LaGuardia declared that pinball machines were a form of illegal gambling, targeting these games in New York as a way to fight back against the mob in his city. And while that began on the opposite side of the country, when Pearl Harbor was bombed by Japan at the end of 1941, LaGuardia argued that pinball machines not only robbed children of money, but were using up parts that should be redirected to the US war effort. And in 1942, pinball was declared a form of gambling across the United States, with police raids taking out thousands of machines in a matter of weeks. Pinball status as gambling would be in effect in the US until 1974, but it only took until 1951 for Service Games and Bromley to be kicked out of Hawaii. However, by then, the geopolitical landscape had massively changed with the end of World War II, with major US military bases now in Japan. And guess what? Japan had no rules against pinball. You can guess what happened next. Bromley soon established Service Games of Japan, continuing to import pinball and other coin-op machines to target US military bases and their service members. With arcade cabinets manufactured by other companies, the organization soon expanded to South Korea, Vietnam, and the Philippines. And the abbreviation of Service Games, SEGA, was born when it was used on the side of its slot machines. But the 50s and 60s saw Bromley's company undergo several major changes. Service Games of Japan was officially dissolved on May 31st, 1960 due to US government investigations into their potentially corrupt business practices, only for Bromley to establish two new companies, Nihon Goraku Busan and Nihon Kekai Seitso, which purchased all of Service Games' assets and then merged in 1964, eventually going on to merge with fellow coin-op game company Rosen Enterprises in 1965 to form SEGA Enterprises Ltd, with a focus on jukeboxes, gun games, and pinball that were played by the general Japanese public instead of just US military bases. And thus, SEGA as we know them were born with David Rosen as its CEO. But there was still one more step to go. SEGA essentially served as the middleman for other game manufacturers, companies like Namco and Midway, who SEGA purchased from and then distributed and sold to arcades and other places throughout Asia. As such, their true potential as a company entirely depended on other people's innovations. That all changed in 1966, when Sega released their own version of the Periscope arcade cabinet as the first ever Sega manufactured game. Still, this was somewhat of a half measure, as Sega had licensed the cabinet design from Namco, making their own smaller single-player version of the game, which was much more affordable for arcades to buy and import. One important note here, we're still not actually at video games yet. I know, give me time. Instead, Periscope was actually an electromechanical game, meaning that this submarine simulator used electricity to move mechanical ships inside the cabinet with lights, sounds, and physical movement. And it's so cool. It's also really innovative for its time, and with the Sega Periscope being exported to Europe in 1967 and the US in 1968, the little company that was once on the run from US gaming law began to turn into an international gaming juggernaut. Across the 60s and 70s, Sega found more and more success with electromechanical arcade cabinets like Missile, which helped innovate the use of the joystick, and Jet Rocket, the first ever first-person flight simulator. That success brought the attention of Gulf and Western Industries from the US, which bought Sega in 1969, leaving Rosen as Sega president and leading to Bromley, the man behind Sega's creation, to retire. This led to the big moment, Sega's first ever video game that they made, Pongtron in 1973. And I know what you're thinking. Can I get sucked inside it and go on an adventure? No. Is Matt about to turn this into another Tron video? Also no. Is this just a clone of Pong? Yes. Pongtron is just a Japanese clone of Atari's Pong from the year before, but with its vertical cabinet and CRT TV, Pongtron wasn't just Sega's first true video game, but one of the first ever video games in Japan, alongside Taito's Elapong. Yes, that's just Pong 2. Look, they were still figuring it out, okay? But with video games quickly proving themselves to be a pretty big deal, and I think the next 50 years have continued to prove that to be true, Gulf and Western told Rosen and Sega to go all in on the field. In order to start developing faster, Sega purchased US game company Gremlin in 1978 and created games including Frogger, Head On, Space Attack, that's just a Space Invaders clone, Hang On, Monaco GP, Champion Boxing, and more, until Gulf and Western sold Sega to Bally Manufacturing in 1983. See, the early 80s saw another major development in the video game industry, home computer consoles, with consoles like the Atari 2600, the Atari 5200, and the Commodore 64 creating another boom period. And so Bally licensed out Sega to make video games that would appear on these other consoles. This huge boom would lead to the biggest downfall in the entire video game industry, the video game crash of 1983. Now, if you're a video game fan, then I'm sure you've heard of this period before, with visions of landfills brimming with ET games, empty Atari offices, and the angry video game nerd filling your mind. Many companies folded as the rise of home computers smashed the video game and arcade industries, specifically in the United States, with US game sales of $3 billion in 1982 dropping to $100 million in 1985. As for Sega, the biggest impact was that their financial losses led to head David Rosen and Hayao Nakayama, head of Japanese distribution, personally investing in Sega to buy back its name and all of its assets from Bally. Now, there were two major divisions of the same company, Sega of America, or SOA, and Sega of Japan, or SOJ. Okay, can I finally say that the Sega that we know today was finally truly established? Took long enough. But most importantly, US video game companies were destroyed by the crash in ways that wouldn't be healed for decades. However, Japanese video games remained strong. As a result, Sega had a huge opportunity ahead of them, and alongside them was the company that would be their greatest rival, Nintendo. By the late 70s, Nintendo Co. Ltd. had transitioned from their origin as a Japanese playing card company formed in the late 1800s, to electronic toys, to video games with their color TV games and light guns, as well as the handheld Game & Watch. Their continued success was an obvious inspiration to Sega, and in 1983, everything truly changed forever with the release of both the Nintendo Famicom and Sega's SG-1000 on the same day, July 15, 1983, in Japan. It's frankly insane that after decades of innovation, what is essentially the modern video game was created by two rival companies on the exact same day, and for the next 2 decades, Sega and Nintendo would exist as bitter rivals. With the video game crash making the United States somewhat of a no man's land for video games for a few years, Nintendo's Famicom American release would be delayed until 1985, when it would be released as the Nintendo Entertainment System, or NES. As for Sega, the company would take a very different route, continuing to innovate with new consoles over and over again in just a few years. The SC3000, also in 1983, the SG-1002 in 1984, the Sega Mark III in 1985, the Sega Master System in 1986, and finally the Sega Mega Drive in 1988, which would be renamed to the Sega Genesis in North America. While the Master System would underperform, selling only 13 million consoles and having a few established franchises like Alex Kidd and Phantasy Star, the focus on continued evolution meant that Sega could quickly move forward. It's a very different strategy than Nintendo, and as a result, the NES would sell much more than any single rival Sega system of the time, with 61.91 million units sold worldwide, while the Genesis would be far more technologically advanced, with a 16-bit CPU versus the NES's 8-bit. 64 kilobytes of RAM versus 2 kilobytes in the NES, a 7.6 MHz CPU versus the NES's 1.79 MHz, as well as a color palette, max sprites, scan lines, and audio that all blew the NES out of the water. As far as technical specifications go, it was really no comparison. They call that blast processing, baby! Oh, what is blast processing? Well, it's mostly just marketing, but the combination of a multi-layer display and the ability to access more data meant much greater control for programmers. But beyond these stronger specs, the difference was that Nintendo worked to maintain a consistency in their branding and slowly expand the recognition and adoption of the NES that Sega couldn't match. In response, Sega would focus much of the Genesis on arcade ports and an edgier, more mature branding. Games like Altered Beast, Splatterhouse, Revenge of Shinobi, Golden Axe, and more were the edgier, bloodier response to Nintendo's family-friendly image. Sega wanted to go after the 13 and older crowd. Grunge was in, anti-heroes were popular, and while they may not have known it, the edgy 90s would touch every type of media, and Sega was simply early to the scene. And to underline it, Sega and SOA president Michael Katz debuted what's maybe the greatest piece of game marketing of all time, and the line that would define the company.
Get Joe Montana free, Pat Riley free, Buster Douglas free, Super Monaco GP free, or Collins free. What Nintendo?
According to Katz, the success of Genesis initially came from us having the personality licensing position for software. It was defensive and brilliant, if I do say so myself. We could not compete with the strength of the Nintendo arcade licenses. So as a defensive move, we decided to get, for awareness, personalities. However, the Genesis still struggled to hit its goals. A year one plan of 1 million consoles sold in the US was met with only 500,000 actually moved. Sega of Europe was also launched to begin cornering a market that Nintendo largely ignored, although it didn't make a huge difference in sales figures, and as such, Katz was removed as president and replaced with former head of Mattel and Matchbox, Tom Kalinske, who would bring a more aggressive strategy. And only 2 years after the release of the Genesis, Nintendo would make their next leap forward with the Super Famicom in Japan in 1990, released as the Super Nintendo in the US in 1991. Compared to the NES, it was a massive leap forward, and compared to the Genesis, the console was much more competitive. However, Sega's answer wouldn't come in the form of a new system, but a new character that would define the company forever. Starting in 1988, Sega held an in-house competition to create a brand new mascot that would rival Nintendo's Mario. Eventually, this would result in the one and only Sonic the Hedgehog, created by employee Naoto Oshima, which was combined with programmer Yuji Naka's work on developing a game that emphasized speed and movement. And over the course of 14 months and a team of 7, the result was the original Sonic the Hedgehog game, released on June 23, 1991, backed by a massive marketing push and a huge need for it to do well, as Sega's investment and the need for a flagship title were all hanging on the back of it. Thankfully, Sonic was a massive hit, and helped to push Genesis sales in the US to 2.8 million consoles sold in 1991 versus 2 million for the SNES. From here, Sega of America and its president Tom Kalinske pushed hard with edgy advertisements that positioned the Genesis as not just counter to Nintendo, but the reason for your edgy kids being up to no good.
I said chocolate chip.
However, this really illustrates the split that was forming between Sega's American and Japanese divisions, with Japan not adopting this type of advertising at all due to a sort of air of respectability that they wanted to keep within their marketplace. But this, along with Kalinske implementing a price drop in the Sega Genesis and having it packaged with Sonic the Hedgehog, caused Sega to absolutely explode in both Europe and America in the early 90s. Afterward, games like Streets of Rage, Sonic 2, given a simultaneous worldwide launch on November 24, 1992, something that hadn't been done before, and selling a record 6 million copies, the uncensored port of Mortal Kombat, which countered Nintendo's exclusive deal with Street Fighter at the time, and more, all emphasized the darker, edgier element of Sega, even as they also released plenty of family-friendly games. And in 1994, Sega hit what is inarguably its high point, when it sold 55% of all 16-bit hardware in the US, finally beating Nintendo and becoming the #1 game business in the country. However, by the mid-90s, the Genesis was losing wind and unable to compete with not just the SNES, but the soon-to-be-released PlayStation. Sega's solution wasn't a brand new system, but instead a whole bunch of stopgap add-ons to the Genesis. The first was the Power-Base converter in 1989, giving the Genesis backward compatibility with Master System games. Then you had the Sega CD, launched at the end of 1991 and adding not just CD capabilities, which brought their own library of games, but greater processing power and a cost of $299. Then there was the Sega Channel and its adapter, which gave the Genesis online capabilities to access a library of games from the internet. Next was the 32X add-on, which brought 32-bit graphics and a $159 price tag. However, a lack of coordination between the US and Japan branches caused the next full system, the Sega Saturn, to launch at the same time, causing the 32X to quickly flop. All of these upgrades are extremely innovative for their time, and when combined with each being an extra chunk of plastic you slap onto your console, are very 90s. However, the problem is that it was all just way too much for most consumers. How do you keep all of these different pieces of hardware separate in the minds of your potential audience? How do you keep convincing them to upgrade and invest more money in each new piece of add-on for the same system they already have? And what parent is actually going to want to dish out more and more cash for these video game systems? As a result, Sega started to self-cannibalize their own place in the market, leading to dwindling sales with each new add-on. Sega's search for the next stage in video games and an evolution in their consoles would lead to their biggest gamble yet, and the 1-2 punch that would doom the company: the Sega Saturn and the Dreamcast. But before we get to that, let's take a quick break to talk about Sega's handheld games. First, there was the Game Gear, launched in 1990 in Japan and essentially acting as a portable version of the Master System. And while the Nintendo Game Boy would far outsell it, the Game Gear looked, played, and sounded way better. That was followed by the Genesis Nomad from 1995, now essentially a portable Genesis. Unfortunately, its region-locked existence as a North American exclusive, right as the Saturn launched, left the system abandoned, only selling about 1 million units. And I gotta tell you, the more I learn about Sega's approach to handling and selling their systems, the more I understand why they fell so hard. Okay, anyway, back to the disaster. The launch of the Sega Saturn was, to be blunt, a car crash, but it's a car crash that a lot of people forget because it was so quickly followed up by the mega disaster that was the Dreamcast. Specifically, the Saturn's launch was botched because Sega of America and Sega of Japan simply could not get along and could not see eye to eye on not just the type of marketing that they wanted to do, but the importance of the systems and how they would communicate over these systems. In fact, the Sega CD was hidden from the American branch by the Japan division for years prior to its launch. So now, the split that was created a decade earlier in order to survive had now become the start of Sega's downfall. Specifically, the Saturn was developed in Japan beginning in 1992, with Sega and Hitachi working together to create a new dual CPU system for the machine to create both 2D and 3D environments, with reports of Sony's upcoming PlayStation pushing Sega to make the Saturn even more powerful. However, Kalinsky and Sega of America were unhappy with Japan's approach to the Saturn, believing the machine wasn't strong enough to be a true next-gen console. Instead, the American branch specifically focused on the upcoming 32X expansion for the Genesis. And here's where everything starts to go wrong. Originally, Sega believed that the Saturn wouldn't launch until deep into 1995, but fearing competition from the new Atari Jaguar, which is silly to be worried about in retrospect, Sega CEO Hayao Nakayama ordered engineers to have the Saturn ready by the end of 1994. The only problem was that the 32X was already finished. As a result, the Sega Saturn, the company's next big thing, was released on November 22, 1994 in Japan, one day after the 32X was released on November 21, 1994 in the US. In essence, Sega had automatically rendered their own new hardware obsolete, giving consumers the excuse that the 32X was simply a cheaper option for those poors that couldn't afford a Saturn. And not to worry, the US market would still have time, with Kalinsky announcing that the Saturn wouldn't launch in America until September 2, 1995, christening it Saturn Day. Great stalling tactic, right? Well, that is until Sega forced America to release the system early, with Kalinsky announcing at E3 on May 11, 1995, that the Saturn would cost $399 and had already been shipped to Toys R Us, Babbes, Electronics Boutique, and Software Etc. It was a surprise that caught everyone off guard, including KB Toys, Walmart, and Best Buy, who were left out and then refused to carry the Saturn in response. Already a really bad approach, but it was made even worse when PlayStation had their own presentation immediately following Sega, and during it they announced their own price tag, simply looking at the crowd and saying, $299. Which made everyone go nuts and immediately undercut what Sega was hoping and dreaming that everyone would be excited for with their system. And when the original PlayStation was released in North America on September 9th, 1995, it absolutely bodied the Saturn, with the N64 dogpiling the system when it was later released in 1996. The PlayStation would go on to sell more than 102 million consoles worldwide. The N64 would move almost 33 million. The Saturn, 9.26 million, with 5.75 million of these in Japan alone. Oh, and the 32X sold 665,000. It was a disaster, and such a sheer drop-off from the Genesis that Sega would discontinue the Saturn in most regions by 1998. The system didn't even have its own exclusive Sonic game, with Sonic Extreme cancelled after a disastrous production, and its major selling points being Virtua Fighter, Nights into Dreams, and Tomb Raider. And so, with the Saturn an almost immediate flop and Kalinsky essentially removed from having any power, which he attributed to Japan's executives resenting the American side's success, Tom Kalinsky resigned as CEO of SOA in 1996 and was replaced with Shoichiro Irimajiri. Alongside this, Sega started working on yet another console in 1997. This would be the Dreamcast, designed to be much cheaper to produce and therefore less expensive to buy, and with internet access for online play and downloadable content. However, in order to prepare for the launch of the new system, Sega essentially withdrew from the North American market with the discontinuation of the Saturn, with the company posting its first financial loss in a decade in 1998, as the Saturn lost approximately $1 billion for the company. According to venture capitalist and eventual Sega president Isao Okawa, Sega's business model made no sense, saying, "The bottom line is that Sega was too loose with its money. The business management of Sega left me totally dumbfounded. One of the basics of business is that you hand over the product to buyers and receive money in return. Unfortunately, our management personnel did not even seem to know this basic fact. That is why their attitude has been so nonchalant, even if SEGA is accumulating debt. They have no concept of production schedules or product management on their minds. They think neither of balance sheets nor cash flows. They know a lot about games, but they do not know how to run the company. The Dreamcast would be Sega's biggest bet on reinvention and getting a new stronghold in gaming. Unfortunately, Sega's decision to use widely available pieces of hardware and chips that were on the market meant that they couldn't have complete control over the technology that was being put into their system. Yes, this meant that the Dreamcast could be less expensive, but when there was a shortage of power VR chips during their production of the Dreamcast, Sega simply could not make enough of the console to fit demand and pre-orders, leaving a lot of those pre-orders unfulfilled on launch day. Combine this with Sonic Adventure being delayed and the Dreamcast failing to hit its first-year sales goals in Japan, and Sega ended up dropping the price of the Dreamcast to $199 before its launch in the United States. There were, however, a lot of banger games for the Dreamcast. There is, of course, Sonic Adventure 1 and 2, which pushed the franchise forward in ways nothing had before, as well as Soul Calibur, Shenmue, Resident Evil Code Veronica, MVC 1 and 2, Crazy Taxi, Jet Set Radio, and quite a few more games that were relatively big hits for the system, given the limited number of consoles sold, and which would go on to sell a lot more in the decades afterward on other systems. But the great games didn't really help much. EA Games' refusal to develop for the Dreamcast, glitches with the system's GD-ROMs, and the launch of the PlayStation 2 in 2000 all caused the Dreamcast, which had a successful North American launch, to slow way down in sales at the turn of the century. By the end of the year 2000, the Dreamcast had sold around 3 million units in the US, well below the 5 million that Sega had said they would need to hit to stay viable. This, combined with the consoles selling at a loss and sluggish game sales, caused Sega to post net losses around $500 million each year from 1998 through 2002. That's 5 years of being deep into the red despite continual reinvention and investment into brand new hardware. What came next is the inevitable end we've been working our way toward this whole time, and something that seemed like an impossibility just a few years prior. On January 31st, 2001, Sega officially announced that they would cease production of the Dreamcast on March 31st, only 2.5 years after its initial launch in Japan. By the end, 9.13 million console units had been sold, with about 930,000 of those being surplus inventory sold at major discounts at the time of production being ceased. That doesn't seem like a terrible number until you compare it to other consoles at the time. The PlayStation 2, which you can essentially credit as the Sega killer that did what Nintendo didn't, ended with more than 160 million consoles sold around the world by the time it was discontinued at the end of a 13-year run. The GameCube, seen as a misstep in Nintendo's history but what I think is a banger, even sold more than 21 million units. The sad thing is that the timing of the Dreamcast was perfect. The N64 was several years old and massively outclassed by Sega's new system. The PlayStation was getting old and didn't have the advancements the Dreamcast showed off. And we were still a few years away from the original Xbox, which essentially took Sega's place in the console market. The issue was that Sega had squandered the goodwill of fans during its constant console turnover during the switch between the Genesis and the Saturn, and there really wasn't any killer app or must-have game that drove people toward these new systems in the way that Sonic 1 and 2 did. Instead, Sega over-leveraged their engineers in an extremely costly and frantic attempt to get a new system that stuck and would bring back the fans right now. At any moment, it's gotta be with this one, right? Really, it's sort of like when you have something that's broken in your home and you decide to fix it, but you don't want to go about it in the really professional way. So you sort of DIY it and use what you have and don't make the right corrections. So then suddenly you've broken it and it's gotten worse, and then you panic and you try to fix it again really quickly as everything is going wrong, and suddenly there's water spraying all over your bathroom and it's like, oh my god, now everything is really worse. So you got to shut off the water and you got to go to Home Depot and you got to buy everything that you really needed to get on that first round in order to fix it, but now everything has cost so much more money and has taken so much more time and has caused you to panic, and maybe it's waste even caused even more damage in your home, and really this shouldn't have even happened in the first place if you had just done it right on that first try. No, this is not a personal example. It's just that in Sega's case, it was billions of dollars invested and lost on a global stage. In the span of just 12 years, Sega had made 8 different consoles. That's not including slightly different versions for different regions, or moderate upgrades like the Mega Drive 2 or CD Model 2. That's insane. It's clear that Sega flooded the market, burning out their fan base just when they needed them the most. And when something truly innovative like the Dreamcast was released, fans didn't show up, and Sega didn't have the inventory to make their presence felt in the market. The Dreamcast wasn't the must-have console of the late 90s. It was that elusive, odd system that your friend's uncle had, but you could never get yourself. And with the Dreamcast discontinued and Sega in a bad financial situation, the company would never again make a new system. In fact, Sega would have likely gone bankrupt if it was not for Isao Okawa forgiving the hundreds of millions of dollars of debt that Sega owed him, and then providing the company with another $695 million before his death in 2001. Okawa had saved Sega, but what would they do now? So, with Sega out of the console-making business for more than a quarter of a century, what has the company been doing now to stay profitable and to keep their money-making franchises going? Well, it really came down to doing what seemed like an impossibility during the console wars, producing games for other companies, including Nintendo, and alongside that, Sega has gone through a ton of changes. In 2004, pachinko company SEGA Corporation bought the majority of Sega's stock, resulting in the new conglomerate of SEGA Sammy Holdings, with the company placing its focus on arcades and new arcade cabinets in the hope of finding a new avenue for success. This led to Sega unexpectedly crossing over with another of my Rise and Fall videos when it became the sole owner of GameWorks arcades after its previous owner, DreamWorks, fell apart. However, as is no surprise to anyone familiar with the gaming industry, arcades would slowly dwindle over the following decade, pushing Sega to once again find new avenues of business. And despite having suffered such a massive fall just a few years before, the 2010s was filled with Sega acquiring other companies, including Creative Assembly, Sports Interactive, Technosoft, and Index Corporation, as well as forming Sega Racing Studio. Throughout the 2000s and 2010s, Sega continued to put out new games, both as developer and publisher for other studios, while maintaining a small arcade presence and mostly creating these games for other major systems, including Nintendo, PlayStation, and Xbox. If you were a Sega fan growing up, seeing that logo pop up for a different console felt like watching pigs fly, but today, it's extremely common. And some of the Sega games made during this era were big hits: Crazy Taxi sequels, Yakuza, Condemned, Alien Isolation, but plenty more were almost immediately forgotten. It's also the era where Sonic games hit the bottom of the barrel, only to break through that and find a barrel underneath the bottom of that barrel, and yet another barrel under that. This eventually led to SEGA Corporation's reorganizing into SEGA Group, with separate sectors in charge of home video games, arcades, theme parks, and mobile games. Unfortunately, the late 2010s also saw Sega as a whole experience a massive decline in business, with a 70% decrease in profits during 2018, leading to the company pulling back from a lot of its newer ventures, and instead refocusing on the tried and true franchises like Yakuza and Sonic, as it once again became known as SEGA Corporation. All of these changes, of course, resulted in many different arrivals and exits in the company's head roles, with the 2020s seeing Sega bought out by Genda Inc. and its amusement park holdings all sold off. And honestly, despite Sega having quite a few hit games in the last few years, like Persona 5 Royal, Yakuza 0, Phantasy Star Online 2, and Sonic X Shadow Generations, it's been really rough going for Sega. Layoffs every year, constant restructuring, big bold announcements of franchises being revived only for development to go nowhere. Honestly, if it weren't for Sonic, who gets at least 2 games every year, as Sega continues to turn him out on the street corner for fast cash and bad games, and the massive movie franchise he's turned into, Sega would have very little to show for everything they've made over the years. Most recently, Sega posted a net revenue of $2.89 billion in 2025, essentially holding about even versus Nintendo's $14.6 billion that same year, massively increased by the Switch 2 and and showing just how far apart these once bitter rivals have grown. And yet, despite the company seemingly hell-bent on turning all that goodwill from fans sour with a whole lot of stinkers that they've put out over the last several decades, SEGA continues to limp on, kept afloat by their once golden and completely unique reputation. In some ways, SEGA's fall has turned them into a legend that was crystallized during the heyday of classic gaming. After surviving the video game crash, helping to revolutionize the world of video games during a pivotal time, and essentially being one of two companies that any kid had to choose between as they were growing up during a certain age, SEGA has become beloved either by a generation that grew up with them, or a generation that has come of age seeing them as old legends. SEGA is also fully aware of their existence as something of a nostalgia act, with the company producing the SEGA Genesis Mini in 2019 and the SEGA Genesis Mini 2 in 2022, technically their first console productions in more than 20 years. Although these are simply small, hard-coded emulators of the classic system designed to capture nostalgia for the company's heyday that have both been discontinued in the time since. In looking back at SEGA's history, you can truly see a company that was consistently trying to innovate while they fought for dominance in the industry. Consoles like the Genesis, Sega CD, Game Gear, and Dreamcast were trying to not just be the top of the line for their times, but forward-thinking. Combine that with an attitude and branding that screams 1990s counterculture, and it's no wonder that SEGA fans are loud and proud about their love for the company. But in the end, it's some of those daring attempts to keep pushing the envelope, combined with a lack of coordination and even some animosity between the American and Japanese sides of the company, that made everything so much more complicated, that led to SEGA's fall from grace in just a few major missteps. And in looking back at the entire history of SEGA, its golden era is truly the last several years of the Genesis, where the console consistently outsold SNES in America, Sonic the Hedgehog became a phenomenon, and the company was riding high on a great system that people loved. Everything after was a series of poor choices that slowly slid down into collapse, with nothing ever being able to match the few years where it all came together just right. So, what does the future hold for SEGA? Honestly, it seems like more of the same. For the last 25 years, SEGA has essentially been in a holding pattern of keeping the same few successful franchises alive, with no new entries into new series really given all that much life. Honestly, what was the last big franchise that SEGA developed? I'm talking developed, not published. Yakuza? The first one was in 2005. Yes, people like those games in about 1 out of every 10 Sonic games, but what has SEGA done to make people excited about them today, and not just looking back at the past they loved? I'm sorry, these Rise and Fall videos always end up being such a bummer, but I guess that's just where these stories inevitably end when you just look at their title. As for SEGA, maybe nothing will ever truly be over as long as franchises like Sonic and whatever nostalgia act they dig up keeps bringing people back. But looking back today, it seems almost impossible that this was once the company that nearly conquered the global gaming industry. Hey, at least we'll always have the memories. Thanks for watching today's video, and it's a return to my long-running Rise and Fall series, but this time with a very different focus. In the past, these have all been about movie studios and movie creators, but I wanted to talk about video games, because that's been a big part of my life for just about as long as I've been alive. And in looking at what I wanted to talk about, I actually originally wanted to do a video on the rise and fall of Acclaim. But I wanted to put that off for a little bit to see how people would respond to these sorts of rise and fall of video game videos, and hopefully you've enjoyed this one. And I thought there are few bigger rise and fall stories in the video game industry than that of SEGA. And I found that in researching all of SEGA, it took a lot of interesting twists and turns that I never knew about before I looked into it. I found it to be really fascinating, and with a lot of really bad decisions, but also a lot of near successes that just went wrong at the last moment. Really, SEGA did this to themselves in a lot of ways. Obviously, you can never fully control the industry that you work in, but in what they did with so many of their console switchovers and the way that Japan and America in their branches was essentially at war with one another, you can absolutely see where they did this to themselves. All in all, SEGA is one of the most unique brands in all of video gaming, especially during the 90s, and everyone's always going to have a soft spot for SEGA and Sonic and a lot of their great franchises. Where they go from here, I honestly don't know, but I think they're just going to keep limping on based on their franchises that never seem to die. I'd love to hear your thoughts on SEGA, any other video game companies that you'd like for me to cover in these videos, and your own personal favorite SEGA games. As always, a huge thank you to my members and patrons for their continued support, and if you'd like to be a member or patron, it's only $2 a month for early access to every video and exclusive reviews, with August's exclusive review being H.P. Lovecraft's Call of Cthulhu. So until next time, I hope that you're taking care of yourselves and doing what Nintendo don't.